A routine arrest turns into a career-shattering mistake when a police officer, blinded by bias, wrongfully detains a woman, only to discover she's an FBI agent. In one explosive moment, everything he thought he knew comes crashing down. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where are you watching our videos from? Drop your location in the comments below, and let's see how far this community reaches. It was a peaceful evening at the Green Leaf, a cozy little restaurant in the heart of the city. Families filled the booths, chatting and laughing, while soft jazz music drifted through the air. The low hum of conversation and the occasional clinking of cutlery created a warm and familiar atmosphere. The walls were lined with pictures of the city's skyline, and the golden lights hanging above the tables added to the restaurant's relaxed and comforting feel. Grace Johnson sat alone at a corner table, quietly flipping through the pages of a thick book. She was dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks, her posture poised but relaxed. Her meal, a simple plate of pasta, sat in front of her, untouched for the moment, as she seemed more interested in the words on the page. To anyone else, she appeared to be just another diner, enjoying a quiet evening out. The young waitress, Sarah, watched her from behind the counter, a bit nervous but unsure why. Something about the woman at the table seemed important, but not in a way she could put her finger on. Grace was polite and soft-spoken when she'd ordered her meal, offering a kind smile and a quiet thank you. Still, Sarah couldn't shake a slight uneasiness, as if something unusual was about to happen. Then the door to the restaurant swung open with the faint jingle of the bell. In walked Officer Barnes, tall and broad-shouldered, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk hunting its prey. He was a well-known figure in this part of the city, and not always in a good way. His reputation for being quick to make judgments, especially about certain people, was whispered about but never openly challenged. His face was hard, like stone, and his movements deliberate as he made his way inside. As he stepped further into the restaurant, Barnes's gaze landed on Grace. Instantly, suspicion flickered in his eyes. He noticed the book on her table, her quiet posture, and the way she sat alone. It was as if, in his mind, something didn't fit. She seemed too calm, too out of place, too suspicious. A gut feeling stirred in Barnes, the kind that made him certain something was wrong. He didn't know who she was or why she was there, but it didn't matter. To him, she looked like trouble. Barnes approached the counter, where Sarah stood fidgeting with her apron. Leaning in close, he whispered to her, his voice low and commanding. "Who is she? The one sitting in the corner?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Grace's table. Sarah blinked, her brow furrowing as she glanced in the direction of the corner table. I don't know," she stammered, clearly flustered by his intensity. "She just came in and ordered dinner. She hasn't done anything." But Barnes wasn't satisfied with that answer. His mind was already racing, jumping to conclusions faster than he could stop himself. The quiet woman, the one sitting there reading, couldn't possibly be innocent. She looked suspicious, he muttered under his breath, not caring whether Sarah heard or not. He straightened up, his expression growing darker by the second, and started toward Grace's table with a determined stride. As Barnes moved closer, the once peaceful restaurant began to shift. It was subtle at first, like the flicker of a candle before it goes out. People noticed the officer's stiff posture, the tension in his steps, and the way his eyes locked onto the woman at the corner table. Whispers began to ripple through the room as customers exchanged nervous glances, sensing that something wasn't right. The cheerful buzz of conversation quieted, and even the soft music seemed to fade into the background. Grace, still engrossed in her book, hadn't noticed Barnes yet. She was lost in the world of her novel, unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away from her. Her meal remained untouched, and she occasionally reached for her glass of water, completely at ease in her own space. But around her, the air was thickening with unease, the kind that makes people shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they should stay or leave. Barnes's boots echoed on the floor as he approached, each step a drumbeat of impending conflict. He was so certain, so convinced that Grace was up to no good, that he couldn't see the peaceful scene for what it was. His mind was already made up, and as he neared her table, his hand unconsciously moved toward the badge clipped to his belt, ready to assert his authority. Sarah, watching from behind the counter, bit her lip. She wanted to say something, to stop him, but what could she do? He was the police, and she was just a waitress. The restaurant's usual hum of activity had now completely died down. All eyes were slowly turning to the scene unfolding at the corner table, where an officer was about to confront a woman who had done nothing more than enjoy her dinner. Barnes was just steps away from Grace now, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to speak, to demand answers, and perhaps to make a terrible mistake. Without any warning or pleasantries, Barnes barked, "Ma'am, I need to see your ID. Right now." Grace looked up from her book, startled, her calm demeanor quickly replaced by confusion. Her eyebrows knitted together as she met Barnes's intense gaze. For a moment, she was silent, trying to understand why he was speaking to her like this. She blinked, not comprehending what she had done to attract this kind of attention. "I'm sorry, what's the problem?" she asked politely, her voice calm but tinged with confusion. Barnes wasn't interested in an explanation. His eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer, the smell of coffee and authority radiating from him. "I said, let me see your ID. Now." The harshness in his voice sent a wave of nervousness through Grace. She could feel the weight of the entire restaurant watching her, eyes burning into her back, silently questioning what was going on. Her hands trembled slightly as she slowly set down her book and reached into her purse for her wallet. "I don't understand," she said, her voice quieter now, almost shaky. "What's going on? Why are you asking for my ID?" Barnes' patience, thin as it was, snapped. His face turned an alarming shade of red, his jaw tightening. "You don't ask the questions here," he shouted, his voice echoing through the restaurant like a thunderclap. The sound startled several people, who recoiled in their seats, eyes wide with fear. Grace's heart began to race as she pulled her wallet from her bag, her fingers fumbling. She didn't know what she had done to warrant this level of aggression. Her breaths quickened, and her hands shook harder as she tried to retrieve her ID, her mind spinning in confusion. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room staring at her, judging, wondering if she was indeed the criminal Barnes had already decided she was. Suddenly, Barnes reached forward with one swift motion and grabbed her arm, yanking her out of her seat with a force that made her stumble. The chair scraped loudly across the floor, breaking the silence. The violent movement caused Grace's wallet to fall to the ground, her ID still tucked inside it, and she let out a small gasp of shock and pain as his grip tightened on her wrist. "Stand up," Barnes barked, pulling her to her feet. "You're under arrest." Grace's mind raced. Under arrest? For what? She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even raised her voice. Tears stung her eyes, but she fought them back, trying to keep calm. Her voice trembled as she tried to reason with him, her words almost lost in the thick air of the restaurant. "Please stop," she pleaded softly, struggling to keep her voice steady as her arm throbbed in his iron grip. "I haven't done anything wrong. Just let me show you my ID." But Barnes wasn't listening. His grip tightened, his knuckles white as his own anger consumed him. In his mind, he had already made his decision. To him, Grace was suspicious, dangerous even. His prejudice had taken over, clouding his judgment. It didn't matter what she said or how calmly she spoke. To him, she was guilty. "I don't need any more of your lies," Barnes shouted, dragging her toward the door. His voice was filled with a certainty that only he could see, as if in his mind, Grace's guilt was already proven. Grace's knees buckled slightly, and she struggled to keep up with him as he pulled her forward. She felt utterly powerless, trapped in a situation she didn't understand. The pain in her wrist, the humiliation of being dragged across the floor, the heavy stares from the other patrons. It was all too much. Her voice, once calm and measured, now broke into desperation. "Please, I didn't do anything," she cried out, her voice trembling with fear. "I'm not a criminal. You're making a mistake." But Barnes wasn't hearing her, and it was clear by now that he didn't want to. He was focused on one thing, removing what he believed to be a threat. His own blind anger and prejudice had wrapped around his mind like a fog, blocking out any sense of reason. He didn't care about the truth, didn't care about what she had to say. Around them, the restaurant remained deathly quiet, save for the scraping of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Eyes were wide, and some customers had their phones out, recording the incident, but no one dared to step forward. Some murmured in low voices, a mixture of fear and anger bubbling under the surface. How had this quiet evening turned so ugly, so fast? One older man in the corner shook his head, muttering to his wife, "This isn't right. She didn't do anything." But even as whispers of disapproval spread through the restaurant, no one stood up, no one moved to help. The fear of authority, of the consequences of speaking out, was too strong. As Barnes dragged Grace toward the door, her face flushed with humiliation, she looked around the room, silently begging for someone to step in, to tell him to stop. But all she saw were eyes filled with uncertainty and fear. Her heart pounded in her chest, her voice breaking as she gave one last desperate plea. "I haven't done anything wrong," she cried, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. As Officer Barnes dragged Grace toward the door, his grip still tight around her wrist, she stumbled on the edge of the floor mat, nearly falling to the ground. Her purse, hanging loosely on her shoulder, slipped and hit the floor with a dull thud. The contents of the bag spilled out, scattering across the entrance of the restaurant: a wallet, a phone, and something small and shiny that caught the light just right. It was a badge. It wasn't just any badge, it was an official FBI badge. The letters stood out clearly, impossible to miss. The young waitress, Sarah, who had been nervously watching everything unfold from her spot near the counter, gasped loudly. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide in shock. That's an FBI badge," she exclaimed, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Her words sliced through the tension, and suddenly all eyes turned to the fallen badge, reflecting like a beacon of truth in the middle of the room. Barnes froze in his tracks, his heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to catch up with what he was seeing. Could it be true? His grip on Grace's arm loosened slightly, but his body remained rigid, as if trying to process the possibility that everything he thought he knew about this woman had been wrong. Grace, who had been shaken and terrified just moments ago, now stood a bit taller. Despite the handcuffs digging into her wrists, she seemed to find a reserve of calm strength within herself. Her eyes, which had been filled with fear and confusion, were now steady and composed. She looked straight into Barnes's eyes, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of her authority. "I'm Special Agent Grace Johnson," she said firmly, her voice carrying throughout the restaurant, "with the FBI." Barnes blinked, his mind spinning. He felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. His throat went dry, and his breath quickened. His face, which had been flushed with anger just moments ago, now turned pale. You're an FBI agent," he stammered, disbelief thick in his voice. Grace nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact with him. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice calm, but edged with a cold finality. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The restaurant, once filled with murmurs and whispers, was now completely silent. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Barnes could feel the eyes of every single person in the room on him, their gazes burning holes into his back as he stood there, paralyzed by shock. He looked down at the badge again, lying on the floor as if mocking him. His mind raced, trying to piece together how he had let things spiral this far. An FBI agent. He had just manhandled an FBI agent. He had put her in handcuffs, in front of everyone. The realization hit him like a speeding train, leaving him reeling. His hands shook as he reached for the handcuff key. Fumbling, he tried to undo the cuffs, his fingers clumsy and unsure. The once commanding officer now seemed small, unsure of himself, his confidence shattered. He struggled to fit the key into the lock, his fingers slipping, as if the universe itself was punishing him for what he had done. "I didn't know," Barnes stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." Grace watched him silently, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to raise her voice or show anger. Her mere presence, her calm control, spoke louder than any outburst ever could. As the handcuffs clicked open, she rubbed her wrists, the red marks from Barnes's tight grip still visible. "That's the problem, Officer Barnes," she said quietly. "You didn't care to know." The silence in the room was suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. The tension that had been simmering throughout the evening had now boiled over into something else entirely: shock, disbelief, and shame. Customers who had been too afraid to speak earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many of them unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. Some had their phones out, still recording, capturing every second of Barnes's downfall. Barnes stood there, his face drained of color, his hands still trembling as he held the unlocked cuffs in his hands. He had made a terrible mistake, one that could cost him everything. The anger and confidence that had fueled him just moments ago were gone, replaced by a deep, sinking feeling of regret and fear. Grace bent down, picking up her fallen badge and placing it carefully back into her purse. She stood tall once again, adjusting her shirt and brushing off the dust from her clothes. Despite the humiliation and pain she had just endured, she carried herself with dignity, her presence commanding respect from everyone in the room. Barnes opened his mouth, as if to apologize, but no words came out. He wanted to say something, anything, to make things right, but he knew that there was nothing he could say that would fix this. The damage was done. Grace's eyes softened slightly as she looked at him, not with anger but with disappointment, a look that cut deeper than any harsh word ever could. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her head held high, her steps steady. As she reached the doorway, she paused and turned back to Barnes one last time. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of finality. "Next time, maybe you'll think before you act. Don't miss out on more powerful, gripping stories that challenge perceptions and reveal hidden truths. Subscribe now and be the first to experience unforgettable narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat."